Elijah Brooks, a respected black attorney, was driving through his own neighborhood when flashing lights shattered his peace. Officer Rachel Dorsey stopped him, eyes sharp with suspicion. "This car's reported stolen," she said, ignoring his calm explanation and legal credentials. What happened next would ignite a firestorm. Elijah, wrongfully cuffed beside his own luxury vehicle, exposed a deeper truth. Even success can't shield a black man from racism. What unfolded wasn't just personal, it cracked the mask hiding systemic bias. Before we move in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that demand to be heard. Elijah Brooks was a name you'd find in law journals, courtroom headlines, and political think pieces. A prodigy-turned-powerhouse attorney, he was known not only for dismantling corrupt systems with cold precision, but for standing firm in the face of injustice, even when it struck too close to home. But nothing could have prepared him for what unfolded one evening in Crestwood Hills, a quiet, suburban enclave with neatly trimmed hedges, sparkling sidewalks, and an unspoken code about who belonged and who didn't. Elijah had just wrapped up a brutal week of courtroom battles, each case more draining than the last. He finally rewarded himself, cruising in his brand-new graphite black Jaguar F-Type, sleek, smooth, a symbol of years of sacrifice. But what he didn't know was that the same car turning heads would also turn suspicion toward him in the ugliest way. The sun had barely dipped behind the hills when Elijah made a slow turn onto Maple Ridge Avenue, jazz humming low from his speakers, the evening breeze weaving through the open window. This was his peace. This was his home. But within seconds, that peace was torn apart. Red and blue lights flared behind him. A short, piercing siren broke the calm like a gunshot. His heart sank, not because he feared the law, but because he knew the script. It had played out too many times. But this time, he was the star. He pulled over, hands at 10 and 2, calm, measured. When Officer Rachel Dorsey stepped out, her eyes already screamed judgment. No hello, no explanation, just a curt demand. License and registration? Elijah offered both, along with his Bar Association ID. "I'm Elijah Brooks. I live here," he said steadily, gesturing toward the elegant brownstone just up the block. Dorsey barely glanced at the IDs before stepping back and calling it in. Then came the question that made his skin crawl. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Elijah didn't flinch. Not yet. "Officer," he said, "what's the reason for this stop?" Her response: "You match the description of a suspect. This car was reported stolen." Her voice was sharp, mechanical, as if rehearsed. He blinked. "This is my car. I have the title in the glove compartment. Please, step out." The tone made it clear this wasn't a request. It was a warning. Elijah stepped out, slowly, knowing full well that even a slight misunderstanding could turn fatal. He could feel it. Her gaze didn't see an accomplished black man. It saw a threat. She didn't ask questions. She didn't call a superior. She radioed for backup. A second cruiser pulled up fast, tires grinding. Officer Clint Reynolds stepped out, towering and silent, already reaching for his cuffs. "We found something," Dorsey called out, lifting a small black bag from Elijah's trunk, a bag he knew wasn't his. "Sir, can you explain this?" Elijah stared, pulse hammering. Inside were several small vials and a rolled wad of cash. "That's not mine," he said, every syllable burning with disbelief. "That bag wasn't there." Of course it wasn't, Dorsey said, her lip curling. That's what they all say. They? Elijah asked, voice cracking with restrained fury. Define they, Officer Dorsey. But she wasn't listening. Reynolds had already clamped cold metal around Elijah's wrists. It didn't matter that he was a celebrated legal expert, a father, a homeowner. In that moment, he was nothing more than a black man in a Jaguar. And that was enough. Neighbors began to appear, peeking from curtains, stepping out onto porches, phones recording. Whispers grew louder. Someone gasped. Another muttered, "Is that Elijah Brooks?" The community he thought knew him was watching, silent and still, unsure whether to believe the man they'd waved to on morning jogs or the officers dragging him away in handcuffs. The humiliation was visceral. Every camera lens felt like a spotlight on his skin, branding him as guilty before any questions were asked. But Elijah wasn't one to go quietly. As he stood by the patrol car, wrists aching, he locked eyes with Reynolds and said, "Run the VN. Call your captain. You're about to make the biggest mistake of your career." Reynolds hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, but Dorsey doubled down. "Save it. You people always have a story." Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "That badge on your ID doesn't scare me." It wasn't about fear. It was about principle. And Elijah's had just ignited into fire. A voice from the crowd broke the tension. "This is wrong!" shouted Gloria Simmons, a retired teacher who'd lived in Crestwood Hills for 40 years. "That's Elijah Brooks. He's the reason my nephew got justice in court." More voices joined hers, louder now, emboldened. "Let him go. Check the plates. We're recording everything." The tide shifted. Captain Marcus Taylor arrived minutes later, stepping from his cruiser and scanning the scene. The moment his eyes landed on Elijah, recognition flickered. "Mr. Brooks?" he asked, stunned. "What the hell is going on here?" Dorsey began to explain, but Taylor cut her off. "Did you verify anything? Run his ID? Check the system?" Her silence answered for her. "Remove the cuffs, now." Elijah's hands were freed, but the damage was done. Red lines marked his wrists, but deeper ones scored his pride. "Captain," he said, voice low and sharp, "you've got a cancer in your department, and tonight you let it spread in front of an entire neighborhood." Taylor looked visibly shaken. "Mr. Brooks, I apologize. Save it. This isn't just about me. It's about every black man who's ever been dragged from his own life and branded a suspect because someone like her couldn't see past her fear." And as the cameras kept rolling, Elijah turned to Dorsey. "You planted that bag. Or someone under your watch did. This isn't over. I will bring everything I have, my law degree, my platform, my voice, and I will not stop until this system is held accountable." That night, the video went viral. By morning, hashtags were trending. #Justice for Elijah, #driving while black, #Crestwood confrontation. And Elijah Brooks? He became more than an attorney. He became a movement. Marcus Lane was a man who had pulled himself up from the cracks of a broken system. Born into poverty, raised in a violent neighborhood where sirens sang lullabies and gunshots replaced alarm clocks, Marcus had every statistic stacked against him. His father was incarcerated before he learned how to read. His mother worked 2 jobs and still had to choose between groceries and rent. But despite the odds, Marcus didn't just survive. He soared. He studied by streetlight, dodged gang recruiters, and worked part-time jobs all through school. He earned a full scholarship, graduated top of his law class, and returned to his city not to escape it, but to change it. He became a civil rights lawyer, the kind of man who didn't just quote justice, He fought for it, tooth and nail, and he paid the price for it. From slashed tires to threatening letters shoved under his office door, Marcus knew what standing up looked like. But he never expected to be taken down not by criminals, but by the very people who claimed to protect the law. That night started like any other. Marcus had just left a late meeting with a local advocacy group. He was tired, mentally drained, but proud. They had secured funding to reopen a legal clinic for wrongfully convicted inmates. He slid behind the wheel of his midnight blue Tesla, a rare indulgence he allowed himself after years of driving a rusted sedan. The city was quiet, humming in soft neon as he made his way home. But just as he turned onto Elmwood Avenue, a blinding flare of red and blue filled his mirrors. At first, he assumed it was a routine check. Maybe a broken taillight, maybe someone else. But the cruiser tailed him, lights swirling, sirens low and insistent. Marcus pulled over, calm, controlled, always aware of how he had to present himself, as non-threatening, as obedient, as humble as possible, because he knew the danger of existing while black. Officer Jenna Rowe approached, hand already near her weapon. "License and registration," she barked, not even bothering with a greeting. Marcus complied, his hands in full view. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped?" he asked gently. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle matching your car's description," she replied, her eyes scanning him like a predator studying prey. Marcus blinked. "This is my car. I'm a licensed attorney. You can verify everything." But Rowe didn't care. She called it in. Then she made him step out of the car. Within minutes, another squad car pulled up. Officer Chad Mercer joined the scene, towering and rigid, his demeanor more aggressive. Together, they searched the Tesla without consent, tossing Marcus's briefcase aside, rifling through papers, and treating his personal belongings like evidence from a crime scene. Marcus stood by, hands trembling not from fear, but fury and shame. Then came the planted evidence. A small black pouch with a half-empty vial of white powder appeared in the center console, a place Marcus never put anything but his phone. "Well, what do we have here?" Mercer muttered. "Sir, care to explain this?" Marcus's heart pounded like a war drum. "That's not mine. I don't know where that came from." Rowe scoffed. "Right. You lawyers are all innocent, huh?" The cuffs came next. Tight, too tight, cutting into his skin. His body was shoved against the hood. Cameras from bystanders flickered to life. Phones held up by people who knew what they were witnessing wasn't justice. It was a scene all too familiar. They didn't listen. They didn't care. Marcus was hauled into the back of the cruiser, humiliated, his briefcase left behind on the sidewalk. The ride to the station was long, cold, filled with mocking questions from Mercer about how many drugs a guy like you sells after work. "And Rowe?" She laughed. "You think you're untouchable with your fancy car and law books. Welcome back to reality." At the precinct, no one checked his ID. No one verified his record. They tossed him in a holding cell, without a phone call, without rights read, without dignity. The hours crawled by. He sat on a hard bench, wrists burning, eyes bloodshot. This wasn't just about pain. It was about the erasure of everything he had fought for. They didn't see Marcus Lane, the lawyer. They saw a black man with a nice car and assumed guilt. It wasn't until the next morning, when a senior detective ran a basic check, that the truth began to emerge. Marcus Lane, licensed attorney. No record. No warrants. No priors. Security footage from the advocacy office showed him leaving at the exact time the drugs were supposedly planted. It all fell apart. But the damage? That was done. They released him with a forced apology and a vague excuse, We were just following protocol. But Marcus didn't need an apology. He needed accountability. His wrists were bruised. His name had already been whispered with suspicion. His briefcase was still missing. But the real injury was deeper. The knowledge that despite his degrees, despite his advocacy, despite his relentless pursuit of justice, he was still just another target in a system rigged with prejudice. Marcus walked out of that station a changed man. Not broken, but burning. He returned to his office, filed a formal complaint, held a press conference, shared his story. The footage went viral. People rallied. The hashtags lit up. Justice for Marcus, out lawyer, not criminal. Systemic racism exposed. But more than that, Marcus launched an initiative, one that offered legal defense for victims of racial profiling. He worked day and night, building a network of attorneys, social workers, investigators. Because if they could do this to him, a man with law on his side, what about the countless others with no defense at all? His hands had bled for justice before. Now they would build it. Jordan Miles never asked to be a hero. He didn't crave the spotlight, didn't walk into rooms demanding recognition. He just believed in doing right. As a middle school teacher in Brookstone, he was the type of man who stayed after class to help struggling students, who bought pencils and notebooks out of his own pocket, who made sure no child felt invisible. Every day, he wore his smile like armor, but under it lived a quiet pain, one that only deepened when the system he believed in turned on him, not because of anything he did, but because of what he looked like. It was a rainy Thursday. Jordan had stayed late grading papers, the halls long emptied. When he finally stepped into the dim parking lot, his worn leather bag slung over one shoulder, he exhaled deeply. He was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, but proud. His students were thriving, his classroom a haven. He unlocked his car, slid into the driver's seat, and began the familiar route home. The streets shimmered with reflections from the drizzle, the rhythmic wipers setting a hypnotic beat. Then came the flash. Red and blue lights cut through the night like a blade. His breath caught. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't rolled a stop sign. Still, he pulled over without hesitation, heart pounding with that all-too-familiar fear black men carry like a second skin. He kept his hands on the wheel, rolled down the window, and waited. The officer approached slowly. Officer Gerald Price, a name Jordan would never forget. "License and registration," Price said flatly, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Jordan complied, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. "Is there a reason I was pulled over?" he asked calmly, trying to mask the tightening in his chest. "You fit the description of someone reported for suspicious activity," Price replied, without looking him in the eye. "Black male, late 20s, dark hoodie, driving a sedan." Jordan blinked. That could have described half the neighborhood. "I'm coming from work," he said softly. "I'm a teacher, just finished grading essays." But Price wasn't listening. Backup arrived before Jordan could speak again. Another officer flanked his car, flashlight darting around the interior. Price gestured toward the door. "Step out of the vehicle." Jordan felt his throat tighten. "Officer, please, what is this really about?" His voice trembled despite his best efforts. "You can check my ID, my school ID. I've done nothing wrong." "Step out now," Price snapped, hand grazing his holstered weapon. Hands shaking, Jordan stepped out, rain matting his hair. He was patted down aggressively, pushed against his car. The officers searched his vehicle without asking, tossing his books, flipping through lesson plans, scattering student essays like trash. He watched, heart breaking, as pages with his students' dreams written in his own careful red ink floated to the wet ground. Then one of the officers shouted, "Found something!" He held up a small Ziploc bag with white residue, pulled from beneath the passenger seat. Jordan's world tilted. "That's not mine," he cried, disbelief twisting his face. "I swear to God, I've never seen that before." But it didn't matter. Price smirked. "You teachers must be learning new tricks." The cuffs were ice cold against his skin. The pain wasn't just physical, it was soul deep. Jordan couldn't believe what was happening. He wasn't just being arrested, he was being erased. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built with love and sacrifice, reduced to a headline waiting to happen. They took him downtown. He sat in a cell that reeked of despair, his soaked hoodie clinging to his skin, his thoughts racing. Would the school hear about this? Would parents believe the news before the truth? Would the kids he'd sworn to protect now look at him with doubt? He stared at the wall, jaw clenched, heart shattered. Then came the news that made it worse. Someone had made an anonymous call tipping police off to a drug dealer matching his description. There were no fingerprints on the bag, no past offenses, but that didn't stop the whispers. The media got wind. Teacher arrested in drug probe. They didn't use the word alleged. They didn't say wrongfully accused. Just arrested. Just enough to ruin a reputation in one click. Jordan was released the next day when the evidence was thrown out. The charges dropped due to inconsistencies. But there was no apology. No headline clearing his name. Just silence. Deafening silence. Back home, he sat alone in the dark, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He'd done everything right, obeyed every rule, smiled through every insult, worked harder than most just to be seen as equal. And still, all it took was a lie and a bias to destroy his name in one night. But Jordan didn't break. The next morning, he stood outside the school. Some parents turned their backs. A few gave him questioning looks. But then, a small voice called out, "Mr. Miles!" One of his students ran up, hugged him tight. "I told my mom you didn't do anything bad." And just like that, the fire returned. Jordan held a press conference, told the truth, showed the footage neighbors had taken, explained what it felt like to be a black man who could teach about justice in the classroom but still be denied it on the street. The video went viral. People rallied. Protesters gathered outside the precinct. Teachers spoke out. Parents wrote letters. You spoke. The name? Reese Morgan. You might not have heard it before, but once you do, you won't forget it. By day, Reese was a quiet figure, a data analyst working in the city's Department of Civil Oversight. Low profile, clean record. Never one to stir the pot. The kind of person you'd walk past on the street and never think twice about. But behind the unreadable eyes and plain clothes was a mind that didn't just notice patterns, it unraveled them. And one day, Reese saw something they couldn't unsee. It started with a discrepancy. A report submitted to Internal Affairs, closed within 24 hours. The subject? A young black man wrongfully detained, claiming evidence had been planted. Reese dug deeper. Found 3 more similar cases. Different officers. Same pattern. All filed. All buried. All victims the same. Men of color, arrested on vague charges, released without explanation, left with reputations in ruins. Something inside Reese snapped. Now here's where the mystery deepens. Instead of going to a superior, Reese went silent. But they didn't stop. They began collecting data. secretly. Piecing together internal memos, patrol logs, GPS locations of squad cars, audio glitches in body cam files. Reese worked after hours, erasing digital footprints, building a timeline. A pattern emerged. Officers on night patrol targeting high-risk neighborhoods, creating arrest reports that looked clean on paper but were laced with inconsistencies. Names began to repeat. Patterns of time, of area, of racial bias too precise to ignore. But here's the wild part. Reese didn't go to the press, didn't call for a meeting. Instead, they vanished. No social media, no calls, no activity on work files. Coworkers said Reese took personal leave. A week passed, then 2. And then the footage dropped. An encrypted file, sent anonymously to 3 major news stations. Inside? Hours of collated footage, redacted reports, voice notes, whistleblower audio, evidence of a coordinated practice of racial profiling and evidence tampering by a unit inside the city's police department. The footage was disturbing. Officers laughing about planting leverage during random stops. Body cam files cut short mid-search. One video showed a man screaming, "That's not mine," as officers pulled a pouch from his trunk. The same phrase repeated across 5 other videos. People were stunned, furious, demanding answers. But the biggest question wasn't about the cops. It was, who exposed all this? The name Reese Morgan exploded across headlines, but no one could find them. Reporters dug, friends stayed silent. Reese had prepared for this, had gone dark with precision, leaving behind only one final message, a short encrypted note embedded in the last file. Truth has a cost, and I've paid it. Now it's your turn to act. The risks? Unbelievable. Reese hadn't just leaked confidential city data. They'd exposed a criminal conspiracy buried in a law enforcement system designed to protect itself. If caught, they could face charges for unauthorized access, breach of security, even federal offenses. But the city was already on fire. Protests erupted. A federal investigation launched within days. Officers implicated were suspended. The mayor was forced to address the issue publicly. Civil rights groups called Reese a hero. Online, the tags started trending. Where is Reese? Hush justice in the dark? Hush unmask the blue line. And still, Reese remained hidden. Some say they fled the country. Others believe they're still here, watching, waiting to see if their sacrifice sparked real change. A few even claimed to have seen them, on a train, in a quiet bookstore, at a rally wearing a hood. But nothing confirmed. What's clear is this. Reese risked everything, their career, their freedom, their future, all for a truth no one else was willing to dig up. They didn't do it for fame. They didn't even leave a face behind. Just facts. Just justice. And the question we're left with is, what would you have done? Would you have risked it all to protect people you didn't even know? Would you dare to bring down an institution from the inside, knowing it could erase your name forever? Would you trade comfort for chaos, if it meant forcing the system to face itself? Reese did. And now we want to hear from you. Cameron Fields wasn't a politician. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't even someone you'd expect to make headlines. She was a single mother, a social worker, a quiet force who dedicated her life to helping those the world overlooked. She didn't crave attention, only justice. She believed in people, especially the broken ones, because she'd been broken once too. Years ago, Cameron had escaped an abusive relationship, fleeing with nothing but a backpack, a toddler on her hip, and a dream to help others rise from the ashes the way she did. She worked night shifts, studied during the day, and eventually earned her degree in social work. Every day, she stood in courtrooms beside forgotten voices. She fought for abused children, for women living in shelters, for teens caught in cycles of poverty and violence. She didn't wear a cape, but to many, she was a hero. But even heroes aren't safe. It started with a child. A 14-year-old named Deshaun, arrested for stealing from a corner store. Cameron was assigned to his case. But something felt off. Deshaun didn't act like a guilty kid. He didn't deny it, but his eyes told a deeper story. As Cameron dug, she discovered the truth. Deshaun hadn't stolen anything. The store owner, furious after a verbal altercation earlier that week, had falsely reported him. The officers, eager to make a quick arrest, never checked the cameras. Cameron brought this to the attention of her supervisor, who told her to let it go. But she couldn't. She filed a formal complaint, reached out to the store owner, begged the officers to review the footage. That's when the threats began. First, her office was vandalized. Papers scattered, drawers emptied. Then, anonymous emails. "Back off, or you'll lose more than your job." She was rattled, but not afraid. She'd survived worse. She kept pushing. That's when they came for her son. Jalen was 16. Honor student. Talented pianist. He was walking home from school when officers stopped him. Said he matched the description of a potential suspect. They searched his backpack. Nothing. But they still cuffed him. Pushed him against the hood of a cruiser. Took him downtown and held him for 6 hours without calling Cameron. By the time she got to the station, he was trembling, humiliated, hurt, and something inside her broke. "I know what this is," she whispered to the desk sergeant. "You're trying to silence me. You think you can scare me by hurting my son?" The sergeant smirked. Maybe he should watch who he walks like. That night, Cameron sat in the dark, listening to her son cry in his room. And for the first time in years, she felt powerless. The same system she worked for had turned on her. She could have walked away, kept her head down, focused on survival. But Cameron Fields didn't run anymore. She gathered every case, every document, every complaint ignored, every name swept under the rug, and she sent them, not to her supervisor, not to the city, but to the media. Every outlet she could find. She attached files, recordings, police statements, redacted case numbers, and a personal letter. "I work in a system that claims to protect the vulnerable while punishing them for being seen. My name is Cameron Fields, and I won't be silent anymore." The story exploded. News anchors read her letter aloud. Hashtags lit up the internet. #JusticeWithCameron, #BelieveTheSocialWorker, #Protect Black Kids. Parents came forward with similar stories. Other social workers began speaking out. And the city? They tried to spin it, called her a disgruntled employee, accused her of violating confidentiality. But it was too late. The truth had already spread. Within a week, the department head was placed on leave. 2 officers were suspended pending investigation. A task force was formed to review all juvenile arrests from the past 5 years. And Cameron? She stood on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by supporters, holding her son's hand. She didn't gloat. She didn't yell. She told the truth. "I'm not brave," she said, voice shaking. "I was just tired of watching kids like mine be treated like criminals before they even had a chance to live." And maybe that's what makes Cameron's story so powerful. She didn't have a badge. She didn't have power. But she had truth. She had pain. She had fire. And when the world pushed her to the edge, she stood taller than ever. When people hear her story, they often ask, why did she risk so much? The answer is simple, because silence was no longer an option. Cameron now leads a nonprofit that trains social workers on how to recognize, document, and report institutional bias. Her son, Jalen? He's applying to college with a full scholarship and plans to study law. And the case that started it all? Deshawn was cleared. The charges dropped. The store owner issued a public apology. He's now mentoring other kids in his neighborhood, inspired by the woman who refused to let him disappear into a broken system. So now we turn to you. Isaiah Cole didn't look like a threat. He looked like someone who carried too much weight in his eyes and not enough sleep on his shoulders. A high school guidance counselor, known for his calm demeanor and fierce loyalty to the kids he served, Isaiah had spent his life walking the line between two worlds, the one he was born into and the one he fought to change. Raised in the south side of a city most people only spoke about in crime statistics, Isaiah had seen what it meant to survive. He'd lost friends to the system, to bullets, to silence. But somehow, he never lost hope. That's what made what happened to him so brutal. It was a Tuesday when everything began to unravel. A routine. Isaiah had just finished his shift at Westbridge High, where he'd spent hours helping a young student named Caden navigate depression and family trouble. It was what Isaiah did best. Listen, advise, protect. He was driving home in his modest Ford Fusion, humming softly to the jazz playing through his speakers, when the lights flashed behind him, red and blue, sudden and searing. He pulled over, calm but confused. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't swerving. As Officer Ronald Pierce approached, hand already brushing the grip of his gun, Isaiah kept both hands on the wheel. Every movement slow and rehearsed, because for black men in America, survival is a performance, calculated, deliberate, and unforgiving. Step out of the car, Pierce ordered. No explanation. No pretense of courtesy. Is there a problem, officer? Isaiah asked, heart drumming in his ears. You match a suspect description from earlier today. Get out now. Isaiah's mouth went dry. What description? He asked, trying to keep his voice even. But it didn't matter. 2 more officers arrived. Before Isaiah could say anything else, he was pulled from the car, cuffed, slammed onto the hood. His cheek scraped the metal. His knees buckled. And in that moment, he wasn't a counselor. He wasn't a mentor. He wasn't even a man. He was a suspect. Disposable. Forgotten. They brought him downtown, accused him of fleeing a robbery that occurred hours earlier on the other side of the city. They said a witness ID'd someone wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, as if that narrowed it down. Isaiah had alibis, proof, time stamps from his work computer, but none of it mattered. The interrogation was relentless. They asked the same questions in different tones. They shouted. They leaned in. They accused him of lying, of hiding something. When Isaiah asked to call a lawyer, they said, "If you're innocent, you don't need one." He sat in a cold cell, fluorescent lights buzzing above him, his thoughts spiraling. Would anyone believe him? Would they call the school? Would the kids think he was guilty? Would Caden think he'd abandoned him? Hours passed. His wrists were raw, his spirit bruised. He thought of his mother, long gone, but still whispering in his memory. Baby, they won't always see who you are, but you never let them change you. Then came the twist. A video surfaced. Security footage from the gas station where the robbery occurred. The suspect? Tall, light-skinned, face partially covered, but not Isaiah. Even with poor quality, the difference was clear. He didn't match, not even close. The officers said nothing, just released him without a word. No apology, no explanation, no concern. Isaiah stumbled out into the night like a man dragged from a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His phone was dead. His car was impounded. He walked home, miles through quiet streets and louder thoughts. When he got home, he sat on his couch and broke. He didn't cry often, but that night, the tears came heavy, flooding from a place too deep for words. The next day, the school principal pulled him aside. Someone had leaked the arrest. Parents were calling. Kids were whispering. He was told to take a leave of absence while things settled down. Isaiah stared blankly. "But I didn't do anything." The principal nodded. "I know. But still. That was the knife." Isaiah stayed home. Days passed. The silence grew louder. He avoided calls, turned off the news, kept the blinds closed. He felt dirty, marked. Like no matter how clean he lived, one accusation, one moment, could unravel everything. But then something unexpected happened. A knock on the door. It was Caden, eyes wide, hands clutching a small notebook. "I wrote you something," he said, "because I know you didn't do it, and I still need you." Isaiah opened the notebook. On the first page, in shaky handwriting, "You told me not to give up, so don't you give up either." That moment shattered something in Isaiah and rebuilt something else. He got up, shaved, dressed, walked back into the world. He shared his story online in painful detail. He spoke at local forums, at schools. He partnered with legal groups to document wrongful stops and detentions. And slowly, people listened. Slowly, people stood behind him. But the scars? They remain. He still flinches when a cruiser slows near him. He still hesitates before wearing a hoodie. He still checks his mirrors more than once. But he walks forward. Because he refuses to let fear write the end of his story. And now you know the truth. Andre Bishop was tired. But not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. He was soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that builds when you've spent your whole life trying to outrun assumptions, prove your worth, and rise above a system that's never been on your side. By 35, Andre had done what many told him was impossible. Once labeled at risk by school counselors and dismissed as trouble by police before he was old enough to drive, he had become a respected community youth coordinator. He ran a center that gave young people a place to feel seen, safe, and heard. The same kind of place he once needed, but never had. He mentored teens coming out of juvenile detention, taught coding workshops, and hosted weekly open mic nights to give young voices power. But no matter how many lives he touched, how many kids he saved from slipping through the cracks, none of it could shield him from what came next. It started with a knock at the center's door. 2 officers in plain clothes, badges flashed too quickly to register. "We just need to ask you a few questions," one said, his tone friendly, but too smooth, too practiced. Andre, always open and willing to help, invited them in. What he didn't know was that they were already convinced he was guilty of something. They were just looking for a way to make it stick. "There's been a report," the second officer said. "An anonymous tip that you've been helping distribute illegal substances through the center." The words hit him like a slap. Andre laughed, at first, thinking it had to be a mistake. A prank, even. "You're serious?" he asked. "You think I'm doing what?" They didn't answer. They just started asking questions that didn't make sense, about names Andre didn't recognize, about kids who hadn't been at the center in months, about cash donations that had nothing to do with any of it. And then they left, with tense smiles and vague promises to follow up soon. Days passed, then weeks. The whispers started. Parents stopped bringing their kids to the center. One of Andre's volunteers said she was stepping back for a while. Then, one morning, Andre arrived to find the locks changed and a posted notice. "The center is temporarily closed pending investigation. No charges, no arrest, no evidence, just a cloud of suspicion, thick and choking." He tried to fight back, hired a lawyer, held a press conference, spoke with quiet pain in his voice about the years he'd sacrificed to build a place that mattered. But all anyone saw was a black man standing under the weight of accusation, and for many, that was enough to step away. Andre sank into silence. He stayed home. He stopped answering calls. He started to believe the thing he feared most, that no matter how much good he did, it would never outweigh how they saw him. But the pain didn't stop there. A week later, someone posted a photo of him, leaving a grocery store, head down, hoodie on. The caption read, "Still out here walking free. Must be nice to be above the law." That one post went viral. Threats followed. Emails flooded in. "We know what you're doing. You're done. We're watching." Andre was crushed, betrayed by the very community he gave his life to serve. He felt like he couldn't breathe, couldn't exist. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, his younger brother Darnell called him in tears. "They stopped me," he said. "Cops. Said I looked like you. Asked me if I was hiding anything. They searched me, man. On the street. Like I was a criminal." That's when Andre realized this wasn't just about him. The smear campaign, the lies, they were poisoning everything and everyone connected to him. He sat in the dark that night, hands shaking, wondering how it had all gone so wrong, wondering if he should just disappear. Let it all go. Let the center die. Let the whispers win. But something deep inside, something rooted in every struggle he had survived, refused to let him quit. Andre got back up. He started recording everything. Every call. Every message. Every interaction. He contacted a journalist he trusted, someone he'd once helped with a troubled teens case, and shared his side. Showed the inconsistencies, the baseless claims, the timeline that didn't add up, the anonymous tip traced back to a disgruntled former employee who had been fired for stealing money from the center. The journalist ran the story. Within 48 hours, everything changed. The community began to rally. Parents spoke up. Teens who had once found their voice at the center released videos of support. Andre gave me a second chance. He believed in me when nobody else did. He's the reason I didn't give up. The investigation crumbled. No evidence, no charges, no wrongdoing. Just a man falsely accused. The city issued a formal apology, but Andre knew better. He knew an apology couldn't undo the damage. It couldn't erase the nights he cried alone, or the days he questioned his worth. It couldn't undo the humiliation, the fear, the heartbreak of watching everything he built nearly fall apart. But what it could do was give him a new voice, a louder one. He reopened the center. But this time, it wasn't just about mentorship. It was about accountability, empowerment, exposure. He launched a new program inside the center, a youth-led media project that investigated local injustice. He called it Truth Seed. Because the truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to grow. Tobias Reed had always been a quiet man. Not because he was weak, but because he believed in listening more than speaking, in working harder than explaining. He was the type of man who showed up early and stayed late, who called his mother every Sunday without fail, and who donated half of his paycheck to the youth literacy program where he once learned to read. He lived simply, worked as a warehouse supervisor, and never asked for recognition. But sometimes it doesn't matter how good you are. When the world sees your skin first and your soul second, goodness is not enough. It began with a mistake. A mistake Tobias didn't make. It was a Monday morning, crisp and ordinary, when he clocked in at 6:03 a.m., just like he had every day for the past 7 years. But this time, something was different. His supervisor, a man named Derek, gave him a strange look, the kind of look that wasn't about greeting, the kind that says you've already been judged. "Need to speak with you in the office," Derek said curtly. Tobias followed, confused but calm. Once inside, he was told that a shipment of high-value electronics had gone missing over the weekend. Security footage from outside the building showed a figure in a hoodie leaving through the back door Sunday night. The face wasn't clear, but the body type? Vaguely similar. And to them, that was enough. That was, "We need to place you on unpaid leave pending investigation," Derek said. "Just protocol." Tobias's mouth went dry. "I wasn't even here Sunday. I was at my niece's birthday party. There are photos, videos. Do you want to see?" Derek hesitated. "We'll review everything, but right now, you need to go." That was the first crack. When Tobias stepped outside, it felt like something invisible had been ripped from his chest. He hadn't just lost a paycheck. He'd lost trust, dignity, place, and worse, no one from work called to check on him. No one asked for his side. In the days that followed, it got worse. His landlord slipped a notice under the door. Rent due in 5 days, or risk eviction. His sister, struggling financially herself, could only offer emotional support. His mother, whose health was already declining, begged him not to stress. "It'll clear up," she said, her voice frail. "You're a good man. God sees everything." But the world? The world wasn't seeing much. 2 weeks in, Tobias was still suspended, still unpaid. And now rumors had started spreading online. Comments under a local crime blog suggested a worker from the warehouse might be involved. His name wasn't mentioned, but the people closest to him knew, and they pulled away. Even his barber avoided eye contact when he walked into the shop. "We're booked today," he said, even though the chairs were empty. One night, as he walked home, someone yelled from a passing car, "Thief!" Tobias froze, heart pounding. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, holding a photo of his father, a man who had died in prison after being wrongfully accused. Tobias had promised himself long ago that his story would be different, that he would live clean, stay humble, do right. But somehow, despite everything, here he was, just like his father, suspected, silenced, alone. But it didn't end there. The real blow came when his mother had a heart attack. The stress of seeing her son unravel, combined with her ongoing health issues, pushed her fragile body too far. Tobias rushed to the hospital, hands trembling, tears burning his cheeks as he sat beside her, whispering apologies she didn't need, but that he couldn't stop saying. She survived. But the guilt? It stayed. That night, he made a decision. He wouldn't let this break him. He dug deep into the case, found the timestamps on his niece's birthday videos, tracked down party guests. He even got a local convenience store to pull security footage showing him buying drinks that same Sunday night, miles away from the warehouse. He brought it all to a civil rights lawyer. And together, they confronted the company. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. The figure in the footage? Not Tobias. Not even close. The real thief was another employee, one who had recently quit without notice. He'd used a stolen ID badge and manipulated the camera angles. The company had known this for a week, but they hadn't told Tobias. They were reviewing options, waiting for legal clearance. When the truth came out publicly, the company issued a cold corporate apology. "We regret any misunderstanding." No press conference, no accountability. But the story caught fire online. Someone leaked the security footage, side by side with the proof of Tobias's innocence. The internet did what it does, and the outrage was immediate. Justice. 4. Tobias started trending. Support poured in. People showed up at the warehouse with signs. Parents brought their kids to meet the man who never gave up. The same barber who turned Tobias away weeks earlier offered him a free cut, eyes watery with shame. And his mother? She watched the interview he gave on live TV and smiled through her tears. "That's my boy," she said, holding his hand. "That's my boy." Tobias didn't return to the warehouse. He used the settlement money and the spotlight to start a foundation, named after his father, to support workers wrongfully accused or unfairly treated. He visited schools and gave talks, reminded young men like himself that silence doesn't protect you. Truth does. But the pain didn't just disappear. There are still nights he wakes up sweating, remembering the moment he was told to leave the building. Still moments when he wonders what would have happened if no one listened, if he hadn't fought back, if he'd just faded into the background like they hoped he would. But he didn't. And now, you know why. Max wasn't just a dog. He was family. A shaggy, golden-coated retriever with intelligent eyes and a loyalty that could be felt in every silent moment he stood beside Evelyn. Their bond had been forged through loneliness, strengthened by pain, and tested by fear. But what they built together was unbreakable. For Evelyn, who had spent the past year battling cancer, alone, uncertain, and on the verge of giving up, Max was the reason she held on. Not just to life, but to herself. And now, after everything they had endured, they stood at the edge of something precious. Peace. It had been months since the night Max saved her life, when he refused to let her sleep through the pain, pawing at her bed until she called for help. That night revealed the tumor doctors had missed. That night, her story changed. And so did Max's. What followed was not easy. Evelyn's diagnosis rocked the community. At 67, she had spent her retirement years quietly, volunteering at the local library, tending to her garden, and sipping morning tea with Max nestled at her feet. Cancer hadn't just attacked her body. It threatened the very simplicity she had spent decades building. She underwent surgery, then rounds of chemotherapy that left her weak, nauseous, and unable to move for days. Her hair fell out. Her appetite vanished. Her once bright voice dimmed to whispers. There were days she couldn't lift herself from the couch, and on those days, Max was there. Not barking, not whining, just being. He lay beside her, unmoving, sensing her exhaustion before she even spoke. He watched her sleep. He licked her trembling fingers. He guarded the door, as if daring death to even try stepping near her again. The doctors were amazed, not just at Evelyn's steady progress, but at the emotional stability she carried through it all. "There's something different about you," one oncologist said during her third cycle. "Your resilience, it's rare." Evelyn smiled, brushing a frail hand over Max's head. "That's because I'm not alone." But behind the sweetness was a truth more painful than many could ever know. The toll wasn't just physical. Evelyn wrestled with deep fear. Fear of relapse, fear of becoming a burden, fear of dying alone. And through it all, she worried. What would happen to Max if I didn't make it? Who would love him the way I do? Would he understand why I was gone? Those thoughts haunted her during her lowest nights, and though she never said them aloud, Max seemed to know. He'd whimper softly, resting his head on her chest, and Evelyn would weep into his fur, whispering, "I'm still here, baby. We're still fighting." But slowly, miraculously, Evelyn began to recover. Her test results started to improve. Her blood counts stabilized. Her appetite returned. And one day, she woke up, looked in the mirror, and saw something she hadn't seen in months, her own reflection, eyes bright with life. She was still thin, still tired, but she was alive. And Max? He wagged his tail that morning with such force it knocked over a small vase, and for the first time in months, Evelyn laughed. That moment, small and private, marked the turning point. The community began to rally around them. The same neighbors who once passed by her house quietly now brought fresh meals and blankets. Children from the library dropped off hand-drawn cards addressed to Miss Evelyn and Hero Max. And word spread. This wasn't just a story about a dog. It was a story about endurance. About listening to instincts. About how love, deep, loyal love, can speak louder than any medical report. Evelyn shared her story at local gatherings, even though public speaking had always terrified her. "I didn't think I had much to say," she told the crowd. "But then I realized, if my story can help even one person listen more closely to their body, or find hope in a hard moment, or look at their dog and see something divine, then it's worth telling." She ended her speech with Max at her feet, her voice trembling. "I thought I was saving Max when I adopted him, but in truth, he saved me." People clapped, people cried. And the video of her speech? It went viral. National media picked it up. Interviews followed. Health blogs ran features on how dogs detect illness. Veterinary researchers began looking into Max's behavior as part of a study. The spotlight was sudden, but Evelyn handled it with grace. Her only request? "Let the story focus on him," she said. "He's the reason I'm still here." And now comes the part you've been waiting for. Today, Evelyn is officially in remission. She's regaining strength, replanting her garden, hosting book club nights again. And Max? He's still by her side. Older now, with a few more gray patches in his fur, but still alert, still loyal, still hers. They walk together every morning. They sit on the porch every evening. And sometimes Evelyn swears Max still watches her a little more closely than before, just to make sure. Just in case. Their bond? It's beyond words. It's deeper than companionship. It's a story, a promise, a quiet miracle that reminds all of us what's possible. And if you're watching this right now, take this with you. Life will not always be gentle. Illness, hardship, and fear, they come uninvited. But so do miracles. Sometimes they show up in white coats, sometimes in soft words, and sometimes they arrive wagging their tail. Max didn't have to do what he did. He didn't have the training. He didn't understand test results. But he knew, and he acted. And in doing so, he saved the most important person in his world. So here's what Evelyn wants you to take from her journey. Listen to your body. If something feels off, say something. Trust your instincts, even when no one else does. Value the quiet companions. Whether it's a pet, a friend, or a neighbor, sometimes the ones who say the least do the most. Don't ignore small signs. Max's paw on her arm was the difference between life and death. Small signs can lead to big truths. Love deeply, fiercely, and without apology. That love may one day be what saves you. And now, we want to hear your voice. Comment below with a message to Evelyn and Max. Let them know their journey inspired you. Like this video if you believe animals have the power to heal. And subscribe to our channel for more real stories that remind us of the good still left in the world. Because Evelyn and Max's story isn't just about cancer. It's about connection. It's about never giving up. It's about holding on, even when everything tells you to let go. And most of all, it's about hope. A hope that walks beside us, sometimes on 4 legs, and sometimes wearing fur and love like armor. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.